A Night to Remember, Lessons in Leadership. The year was 1965, and the actuarial consulting firm I worked for had been bought by one of the big 8 accounting firms. Yes, back then there were 8 of them. Today they have consolidated into just 4, half of what there was in 1965, and they are seeking to reposition themselves as professional services networks. But my experience was in 1965, and that's where this story starts. I soon found that it's no fun to work for accountants, so I was looking for a more people-friendly environment. We were expected to regularly work long extra hours, as though work were the full substance of our lives. For me, it was more than a show. I preferred to work smarter than longer. I yearned to escape. As fall turned into winter, I applied to the Equitable Life, then a major life insurance company, where I came to work for the next 18 years. That was all in the future, though, on the night of Tuesday, November 9th, 1965, a night seared in my memory. You may remember it too. It was about 5:30 p.m., and I was lingering at my desk pretending to be a loyal worker when the lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out altogether. It was soon clear that no one was going to work late that night. A few of us made our way through the darkness down 10 flights of stairs, the elevators weren't running, to the ground at Broad and Beaver Streets. Downtown Manhattan is very dense, and it was very dark. From there, I walked up Broad toward Wall Street in the hope that the subway might be running. I thought that the subways had their own power source, and as I later learned, they had had separate power plants until shortly before that night. Still, not knowing if the trains were running, I went into the darkness below. At the bottom of the stairs into the subway, one could sense that there were many people standing about. I asked, "Are the trains running?" "No," came the answer. "We're waiting to see if they start up again." I've always preferred acting to standing around, so I said, "I'm going to go see if I can catch a bus." What I learned was a lesson that has stayed with me for the rest of my life. As I emerged into the moonlight, there was a full moon that night, I found that about 20 people had followed me up the stairs. That taught me that most people are followers looking for a leader. That simple determination to act instead of wait set people in motion. I lived on the Upper West Side at 110th Street, so I started walking west toward the bus routes. One of the people in the group asked, "Will this get us to the bus terminal?" I understood from that at least some of my new followers were commuters from New Jersey. I answered, "Yes, I can lead you there." Our ranks began to thin somewhat, and they thinned even more when we got to Church Street and saw the buses. They were running, but there were people clinging precariously to the tops. There was no room for more, and it would have been dangerous to try. I turned to my new companions and said, "I'm going to walk." Someone asked, "How far is it?" I answered truthfully, "I'm not sure, but it's a long walk." With that, about half a dozen of us stuck together and began the walk northward along Church Street. The way was well lit by the lights of cars moving along the street. I don't remember the conversation as we went along, but we became firm friends, at least for the duration of our walk together, as the bus terminal neared. The excitement of the shared experience kept us energized. It was an extraordinary moment. I lost my companions at the bus terminal, but I continued on my way northward alone, reaching Broadway at Columbus Circle and then following Broadway uptown from there. I particularly remember looking over at the darkened tower of the Equitable Building as I moved through Midtown after having been walking for an hour. I couldn't help but think of how much shorter my walk would have been if I were working there instead of way downtown in the shadowed streets below Wall Street. That long walk gave me time to think. I recall even now how my thoughts turned to the lessons of leadership that I had already learned during the experience. Most people are uncomfortable with responsibility. That's probably why they prefer to follow. I had first encountered this phenomenon, much to my surprise, in the Marine Corps. I spent 12 weeks in the summer of 1957 in boot camp for prospective officers called the Platoon Leaders Corps. It was there that I learned that an authoritative voice provided something called command presence. It can best be explained by the premise that if you expect to be obeyed, you will be obeyed. 10 hut, forward march, and so on. The Marine Corps taught that you had to learn to follow in order to lead. But the Marines' notion of leadership was one of command and athleticism. The Marine Corps experience was valuable, but that night in 1965 gave me a more nuanced concept of leadership. Back to that long walk home. Periodically along the way, I had tried to find a phone booth to call my wife to tell her I was okay, but they were all occupied. As I neared 96th Street, I found a vacant booth and I moved toward it. A man stopped me. "Don't use the booth," he said. I asked why. "We rigged the booth to get the coins, so it won't work." In the emergency, everyone pulled together, and people who otherwise would rob you became protective. That was a further major lesson impacting leadership learned that moonlit night. No one is all bad. People want to be good, even when one desperation or another drives them to nefarious acts. Eventually, I reached home. I calculated later that it had been a 7.5 mile walk. Now that's nothing for an athlete, but I've never been an athlete, nor have I wanted to be one. My apartment had 4 rooms with windows looking out over Riverside Park and the Hudson River toward New Jersey. What a surprise it was to walk through the door only to see lights on across the river. I thought that surely our lights would soon be on if they had power in New Jersey. The news told the story. We listened to it on a battery-powered radio. The power grid was interconnected, so failure in one segment could be offset by excess generative capacity elsewhere. That was a good idea, but it meant that when a sudden load hit the system after a failure, it could cascade widely. It turned out that the entire Northeast and Southern Ontario lost power, and it wasn't until the next morning that the power returned. As with any unexpected disaster, something good came out of that night. The people at Ebbinger's Bakery in Brooklyn were preparing 7-layer chocolate cake, a New York favorite, when the lights went out. Somehow it all got jumbled together, and the management decided to package it up and sell it anyway. That was the origin of blackout cake, which you can still buy in New York City and elsewhere. Of course, not everyone agrees with that story. Others say that it was invented in World War II because of mandatory blackouts. Nevertheless, I prefer the 1965 story of mixing gone awry in the darkness, and I'm sticking with it. Regardless, with all that chocolate, it's delicious and well worth a trip to New York if you can't find it nearby.